Okay, well, I have to introduce myself, which is a strange experience. And when we thought this up, it seemed like a very light-hearted way to, oh well, let's have a lecture. Of course, since then I've been feeling rather apprehensive about this event and not wanting it to turn into a valedictory one, and keep saying to myself I will be here for another couple of months, so this is not really goodbye. But it's also, for me, very, very moving to be here where I've listened to so many things, introduced so many other people, and now giving a lecture myself. I think there's quite a good tradition of giving a lecture when you leave a place as well as when you start. Anyway, I'm backed up in this endeavour by Simon Goldhill, who I'm sure all or most of you know, who will be the director of CRASSH when I step down. I think it's wonderful for CRASSH, and it's very kind of him to have taken on a response. I'm a little bit anxious about this, of course, but I did steal a peep at his images, because when I put my own images on, so I'm interested to see what he will do. But of course, Simon is a classicist, professor of Greek, and I'm a literary person, and I should say about this lecture that it's part of a book on Twombly, and it's the sort of book that an art historian would never write. It's a rather literary book. That is, I work as a literary critic, and I'm interested in what art historians often don't think about, which is the text. But on the other hand, for me, the materiality of the work is quite hard to talk about, and I find it difficult. Obviously, I don't have that training and those skills, so I'm very interested when I do give parts of this book as lectures to have input from people who are art historians. I know at least one person here who is, and indeed classicists. So this will be for me a very helpful experience. And I think I'm just going to start, and I hope I don't go on too long. So Achilles' horses, Twombly's war, monuments, mourning, and Mars. I got interested in the way in which the theme of war runs through Twombly's work, and particular aspects of it, which I'll talk about. And I have an epigraph which comes from Cavafy, but it was for the eternal disaster of death that those two gallant horses shed their tears, those two gallant horses being Achilles' horses, I'll talk about in a minute. And I put on the screen Twombly's sculpture Thermopylae 1991, which bears an inscription from this poem by Cavafy, a poem which is also called Thermopylae. Now, Cavafy's Thermopylae, which was actually written in 1903, is as much about modern betrayal as it is about the death of Leonidas's army of 300 in defense of Sparta. In this case, Cavafy was writing about the betrayal of Greek struggle in the wake of the Greco-Turkish War of 1897 against domination, the Ottoman domination. Twombly's preoccupation with battles won or lost might be viewed as yet another expression of the historical sensibility immersed in the Mediterranean past for which he's famous. Episodes such as the Battle of Thermopylae, 480 BC, the defeat of Darius by Alexander the Great at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, are of course deeply inscribed on the imaginary of cultural constructions of the ancient world. And overarching them all is a mythic template, Homer's narrative of the 10-year war between the Achaeans and the Ilians. I want to propose that Twombly, like Cavafy, well, you might be forgiven for making that mistake, like Cavafy, uses the mythos of the ancient world to reinterpret war from the perspective of his and also our historical moment. Now, 15 years ago, curating Twombly's 1994 MoMA retrospective, the art critic Kirk Vernadoe, alas prematurely dead, argued for a more complete art historical contextualization of Twombly's work. Instead of looking through an art historical lens, I want to use the lens of war, a kind of thought experiment, if you like. for the generation of European artists who came of age politically during the 1960s, Twombly's achievement, to the contrary, seemed to be, quote, stepping from history into geography, that is, transforming the longue durée of Mediterranean history into a kind of synchronous space. But although he made Italy his home from the late 1950s onwards, it would have been very hard for anyone who came of age shortly before the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 to ignore the US military role in Southeast Asia, not to mention the nuclear arms race of the 50s and 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which even I remember, the Kennedy assassination in 1963, and above all, the mounting casualties, carpet bombings, and protests of the Vietnam War that culminated in the withdrawal of American troops in 1973 and the fall of Saigon in 1975. Throughout these decades, Twombly was coming and going between Europe and New York. From the vantage point of today, Twombly's redrawing of the boundaries of Mediterranean geography to include Asia Minor has proved especially prescient. Given his travels in the region and his interest in ancient history and Sumerian culture, Twombly might well have had misgivings about the deployment of US military forces in the Middle East during the first Gulf War of 1990-1, Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. One can only guess at his reaction to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, widely opposed in Italy as well as the UK. Leaving aside the deaths of untold numbers of Iraqi soldiers and civilians, we now know that this opportunistic war of displaced vengeance did irreparable damage to Mesopotamian cultural heritage, including archaeological sites, archives, and artifacts. I'll end by suggesting that Twombly's work during the 1990s alludes to the tide of blood engulfing a region whose ancient history was marked by military opportunism long before it became known for its oil. So, deeply inscribed in the Eastern Mediterranean imaginary, war constitutes, I think, a significant strand across different periods of Twombly's work. Yet, surprisingly, his martial art has received little attention as such. My argument is that Twombly, whose work tends to be read as either transcendently humanistic or elusively private, uses the past, if you like, dialectically, in Benjamin's sense. That is, the image flashes up, the image of history flashes up as we look back from the ruins of the present. And despite its seeming distance from our contemporary politics, his work contains a commentary on war that is relevant to our contemporary politics of memorial culture. Along the way, he addresses the heady mix of sexuality and sacrifice, pride and objection, imperialism and destruction that has accompanied past wars, continuing into the era of so-called permanent war associated with modernity. War has been called perhaps the most ancient, certainly one of the most powerful of rhetorical topoi. Whether narrative or visual, this topos is shaped both by ancient and modern modes of destruction. The ruination of human lives and cultures on a scale at once individual and incalculably collective continues to inform our inherited war narratives, alongside new narratives produced by modern technology. One of these narratives reinforces the production of masculinity and comradeship through inherited codes of honor, rank and vengeance that bind soldiers to one another and often to violence. Lining it is a counter-narrative of anti-heroic division, brutality, betrayal, and the venial origin of national disputes, blood for oil and so forth. Each narrative calls out for adequate forms of memorial for the dead, whether named or nameless, military or contingent, as we say, civilian fatalities, whether the war in which they died is seen as just, territorial, or shameful. And this call, I propose, is addressed by sculptures such as Twombly's Thermopylae, to which I'll return in closing. Now, the poem cavafy that forms my epigraph. It was for the eternal disaster of death that these two gallant horses shed their tears. This poem by Cavafy refers to Achilles' immortal horses, Xanthos and Balios, as they weep at the sight of Patroclus' lifeless corpse. Riding out to battle in Achilles' chariot and wearing his armour, Patroclus rallies the Achaeans, only to be disarmed by Apollo and killed in turn by Hector. Achilles' immortal horses are caught up in the ephemeral disasters of a stalled war, exacerbated by Achilles' angry withdrawal after Agamemnon requisitions his captive wife, Briseis. The quarrel over another trophy bride has occasioned the 10-year Trojan War, with all its grief and pain, Homer's Penthos and Pema. In Cavafy's words, men have caught you, the horses, you up in their misery. Unlike Zeus, who merely regrets that the gods made them toys of fate, the immortal horses mourn, quote, the eternal disaster of death. Pope's translation of Book 17 of the Iliad is the version that inspires Twombly's monumental 50 Days at Iliam of 1978, which I'll come back to. And Pope's translation emphasizes the anthropomorphic dignity of the weeping pair. I'll read you just part of that wonderful passage by Pope. Meantime, at distance from the scene of blood, the pensive steeds of great Achilles stood, their godlike master slain before their eyes. They wept and shared in human miseries. Still as a tombstone, never to be moved, on some good man or woman unreproved lays its eternal weight, or fixed as stands a marble courser by the sculptor's hands, placed on the hero's grave. Along their face the big round drops coursed down with silent pace, and so on. And Pope's addition to Homer, of course, Homer's text, it is an addition, transforms the horses from a tombstone or stele on a grave mound into an equine monument. Moved by their sorrow, Jove pities the immortal horses, but not enough to halt the whole sorry business. He injects a temporary surge, and the horses rally to the fight. Later, when Achilles sets out to avenge Patroclus' death, he reproaches his horses for letting Patroclus down, whereupon Xanthus, miraculously endued with voice, says Pope, breaks into speech to foretell Achilles' own death. The fates thy death demand, due to a mortal and immortal hand. Portents and prodigies are lost on me, replies Pope's raging Achilles to the suddenly vocal horses. I know my fates. And unmoved by this miraculous intervention, he launches into a frenzy of slaughter, like US soldiers in Vietnam who were urged into battle with the phrase, don't get sad, get even. My point here, however, is that Pope's extended trope of sculptural mourning emphasizes the link between funerary sculpture and poetry in monuments commemorating the hero's death. The talking horses make legible an epitaphic supplement. The monument must speak both to the reader and for the life that has been lost. In Frames of War, When is Life Grievable?, Judith Butler observes that a life has to be seen as livable before it can be grieved, since, she says, grievability is a presupposition for the life that matters. In order to be mourned, a life must count for something. But, she observes, public grief is differentially distributed. Some deaths count for more than others. Open grieving, Butler writes, is bound up with outrage, and outrage has far-reaching political potential. Butler stakes her claims for non-violent protest in terms of an ethics of responsibility that includes, among other things, a sustained practice of translation. She writes between languages, but also between forms of media. The challenge, as she defines it, is to overcome the barriers that make it possible to acknowledge indurability in one site or time, while refusing to acknowledge it in another. In this sense, Butler writes, non-violence is not a peaceful state, but a social and political struggle to make rage articulate and effective. And she goes on, the carefully crafted fuck you. She adds, one has to come up against violence to practice non-violence. An interesting remark. Now, I read her expletive, fuck you, as crafted with care in the USA. Words do injure, as Butler has elsewhere argued, although not in quite the same way as weapons of war. The politics of mourning involve not only translation between past and present, here and there, us and them, but the conversion of rage into articulate forms of linguistic or visual representation. As I hope to show, Twombly's martial art becomes polemical not only when it makes the destructiveness of past wars visible in the present, but when it locates violence on the inside as well as the outside. Violence, in other words, has to be come up against internally before it can be harnessed to outrage. It may even have something to do with the image itself. Okay, that was rather a long introduction. I want to talk about the Achilles thing, as Twombly calls it. It's the Achilles thing, and the shape of the A has a phallic aggression, more like a rocket. It's pointed. The vengeance of Achilles, picture I'll show you, is very aggressive, says Twombly. Now, Twombly returned to America in the summer of 1953 after traveling in Italy and North Africa with Robert Rauschenberg, his friend and contemporary. The Korean War had just ended, but he was unable to defer national service. Following advice to stay out of trouble and score high on the IQ test, he was assigned to cryptography. So his military training proceeded side by side with a project to untrain his drawing hand as it began to trace blindly and in darkness the indirection of the libidinal unconscious, a very famous aspect of Twombly's national service. Conducted at night during his weekend leaves, this project has been described as Twombly's attempt to disrupt the seductive virtuosity of his graphic line. His 10-month period of military service ended in 1954 after he'd been transferred to very uncongenial decoding work at the Pentagon. Declining reassignment to London or Paris, which the Pentagon thought might suit him, threatened with posting to a Midwest airbase, Twombly downed tools and was sent to Walter Reed Hospital for weekend observation, and after an interview, rather cursory interview, I think, with a panel of visiting psychiatrists, he was swiftly discharged on the grounds of anxiety. So much for Twombly's war, which may be credited with teaching him to draw with his eyes shut and to write with a bad hand. Well, 10 years later, by the early 1960s, Twombly was established in Rome. He was recently married and a father, surrounded by fragments of the classical past and by the masterpieces of Renaissance and Baroque art in Rome. In 1962, he embarked on a series of abstract historical portraits of men who had died violently or associated with violence. Very strange pictures, I think. The 15th century Giuliano de' Medici, just his chair, patron of the arts, subject of a famous portrait by Botticelli, assassinated in 1478. The military campaigner Pompey, whom Plutarch called the Roman Alexander the Great, assassinated in 48 BC. The murdered Julius Caesar, assassinated in 44 BC. All of these paintings of 1962. Twombly points to his affinity with the work of Francis Bacon at this time, disordered bodies manifesting disordered minds, gut-spilling violence, powerful men brought to book. Shown alongside these abstract historical portraits was Twombly's Vengeance of Achilles, also 1962. Achilles joins this galère as a man of violence, defined by his rage, his menace, and fated to meet a violent end. Both Twombly's study and the larger painting, I'll show you the study, that's the study, let's go back to that. Both Twombly's study and the larger painting represent Achilles as an abstract, sharply pointed, fire-tipped weapon, somewhere between a gigantic javelin and a rocket trailing tendrils of smoke. Commenting on the towering verticality of the steep trapezoid form, one commentator has alluded to the colossal vertex occupying the entire picture field, a vertex that echoes the shape of a memorial stele. As Twombly himself later said, referring to that vengeance of Achilles with the A shape, it's the Achilles thing, and the shape of the A has phallic aggression, more like a rocket, it's pointed. The vengeance of Achilles is very aggressive. Now, the early 1960s, at the height of the Cold War arms race, was a period when the letter A was anything but innocent. It was a period of spectacular nuclear tests, including Project Starfish, a series of rocket-borne high-altitude explosions in the ionosphere launched in July 1962 as a prototype Star Wars telecommunications shield. These, of course, produced international protests from scientists and astronomers. In a recent essay, Frederick Jameson proposes that the narrative of aerial warfare gave rise to a uniquely modern form, that is, depersonalization of the individual by abstract conceptions far removed from human destruction at ground zero. He contrasts modern air war with individual hand-to-hand combat of what else? Homeric battle. He writes, abstraction versus sense datum. These are the two poles of a dialectic of war, which dictate dilemmas of representation navigable only by formal innovation. In other words, if the threat of it would be surprising if the threat of long-range atomic war had not produced formal innovation. Achilles has the steep-pitched shape not only of his own initial, I always think of A as Achilles, but of the A-bomb, forever associated in the popular imagination with the rocket-borne phallic aggression of Kubrick's Black Comedy of 1964. Twombly's Marshall alphabet, A for aggression, and of course post-Vietnam, A for apocalypse now, starts with a larger than life-size proportion of the Achilles thing. And I think it's appropriate that the desert site of the first atomic tests in July 1945 is commemorated with a very stark memorial stele. Now, the backstory, Twombly's Achilles Mourning the Death of Patroclus, consists of the scribbled words of its title. If I can go back. The scribbled words of its title, here we are, trailing vertical pencil lines with a trickle or two attached, a scrawl of red paint on a stalk overlaying a pencil scribble and brown paint, and loosely tethered the erotic white and red of a paired scrawl. A related pencil drawing names this appendage as the wraith-like shape of Patroclus. Twombly's hand-daubed doodles suggest agitated mark-making under the pressure of inchoate emotions. And in Pope's Iliad, Achilles' reaction to the news of Patroclus' death is couched in the language of impenetrability that signals internal states. A sudden horror shot through all the chief and wrapped his senses in a cloud of grief. At first lamenting the temporary loss even of the impulse to revenge, Achilles turns from grief to frantic violence, wild in revenge, insatiable of war, writes Pope. Achilles mourning the death of Patroclus suggests Twombly's interest in violent and unnameable states of mind. If war breeds hierarchy, status, and masculinity, it also breeds love and hatred between men. The Iliad is a tragic love story that ends with the funerals of not one, but two heroes. And I should just pause and say here, when Twombly was, of course, and Reichenberg were lovers during their travels, and when Twombly went back to America after a pause, Reichenberg was then involved, of course, with another very famous painter, Jasper Johns. The following year produced the Baroque frenzy of the 9-part discourse on Commodus, which I don't much like, 1963, another study of violence and self-division painted in the immediate wake of the Kennedy assassination. Now, these paintings were regarded as an absolute disaster when they were exhibited in New York in 1964 in the context of the rise of pop art and American minimalism. Twombly's discourse on Commodus takes as its subject a 2nd century emperor whose reign is often seen as marking the beginnings of the decline of the Roman Empire. Commodus, whose destructive career was marked by public spectacle, political coups, and again his own assassination, is depicted as a kind of two-headed, bimodal, paranoid schizophrenic. In a letter to his New York gallerist, the 32-year-old Twombly wrote that he had lost his head, quote, i.e. in purchasing an expensive head of Commodus. Twombly is a great collector. But maybe he says it's good to lose my head and gain a new. What some saw as Twombly having lost his head to the dubious influence of Parisian art informelle may have responded to something closer to home, that is, the decadent dolce vita of Italy's post-war economic boom, as portrayed in Fellini's 1960s film. In its own way, Twombly's incandescent so-called discourse parallels the toxic mix of violence and spectacle in the newsprint transfers of Rauschenberg's Divine Comedy, begun in 1959, which of course used pictures of John Kennedy and other contemporary things as to illustrate the Divine Comedy, or Warhol's Death and Disaster series and 13 Most Wanted Men of 1964, a very different genre of work, but nonetheless absolutely tied into a sense of great violence and division in American society. Now, returning to the Homeric theme, in his three-part Iliam, One Morning 10 Years Later, of 1964, Twombly represents the Iliad as a scatological conflict between one polymorphic body and another. Harps and buttocks, or buttocks as harps, litter the battlefield, along with stylized chariot wheels and sexual projectiles. The central panel of the triptych gathers the entire cast, identified by the scribbled names of Menelaus, Agamemnon, Odysseus, Diomedes, Achilles, Patroclus, Hector, etc., and the rest in a confused melee of genital missiles. You can see it's scribbled all over. Penises spewing anuses, breasts mingle with javelins and chariots. Chariot wheels are cancelled out as if in a paper war game. As cynical as Shakespeare's Thersites, lechery, still wars and lechery, nothing else holds fashion. The heart-shaped buttocks and cruising phalluses of the concluding canvas suggest a detumescent interlude. Iliam, One Morning 10 Years Later, as it's called, seems to ask what was all that sex and aggression about? One morning 10 years later, can anyone remember? The same year, 1964, saw the escalation of the war in Vietnam under Lyndon Johnson, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that allowed the US to bomb North Vietnam into the Stone Age without actually having declared war, among other things. The 3-year saturation bombing campaign had resonant Homeric names like Operation Flaming Dart, Operation Rolling Thunder. War, you might say, was in the air, along with flying fortresses and B-52 bombers. One morning 10 years earlier, in August 1954, Twombly had just been discharged from the army and returned to New York, where Rauschenberg had begun to construct combine paintings, and Jasper Johns had his dream, a famous dream, of painting that most ubiquitous of patriotic icons, the American flag. Okay, I'm going to just make a brief excursus called Chariots of Fire. And I have in mind a quotation from Ezra Pound, the famous vorticist. The image is more than an idea. It is a vortex or cluster of fused ideas and is endowed with energy. That's Ezra Pound. Twombly grew up in Lexington, Virginia, where his father, Cy Sr., after the baseball player Cy Young, was a noted, not only gentleman baseball player, but a coach who presided for 50 years over athletics at Washington and Lee University, the burial place, for those of you who don't know, of the first post-Civil War president, General Robert Lee. In the same town as the Virginia Military Institute, the West Point of the South. It's a bit like the place where Osama bin Laden holed up, you know. Anyway, in the same town is the Virginia Military Institute, the West Point of the South. Twombly was surrounded by the classical architecture of antebellum and antebellum and postbellum Virginia. According to Twombly himself, there are more columns between Lexington and Charlottesville than in all ancient Rome and Greece. Two collages, Apollo and the Artist of 1975 and Mars and the Artist, which I'll show you in a minute, pair Apollonian and martial impulses that Twombly elsewhere refers to as sensibility and action. above the artist's lotus sign. I would have one of these little thingies, shows you above the artist's lotus sign. You can see the lotus sign, bottom part there. It's a collage. Apollo is linked to the arts by the penciled words poetry, muses, and arts, and by floating laurel leaves. Mars is identified by shields, the warlike pole axis signs in the top corner, and by half-erased phallic imagery. His energies are aggressively masculine, if not excremental, punning on the Ars Mars in schoolboy mode, M/ARS. You can see the M and the ARS there. Twombly's pairing suggests, solemnly, I suppose, the antimonies of the birth of tragedy, where Nietzsche's Apollo, the god of all shaping energies, represents the principle of sculpture, pictures, and serenity. Dionysus, by contrast, is associated with the non-plastic art of music, and specifically Wagner, by Nietzsche, and with states of madness and ecstasy. Perhaps Nietzsche speculates madness is not necessarily the symptom of generation, of decline, or belated culture. Remember all those pictures of mad leaders assassinated. Nietzsche contrasts the Apollonian Homer with the Bronze Age poet Achilles, the raucous soldier who expresses the delirium of Ares, sword work and spear sticking. This bawdy soldier poet was a favourite of Twombly's, and he calls himself Sergeant to Enealios, the great god of war. Like the modern-day US Marine, he's graphic and sardonic about sex, war and death, and he upholds the soldier's code of solidarity, shield against shield, keep the shield wall tight, and the gift of death they bring, let no man take. You can see the shield wall perhaps up there. I'm being a little literal. Now, Nietzsche's binary points to two different modes of representation: heroic picture-making above the chaos of war versus the foot soldier's visceral testimony. The distinction is still current in modern accounts of battle that focus on the problematics of visibility versus recountability. The history of war as a visual phenomenon includes not only Hobbes' emphasis on spectacle, but Rousseau's distinction between seeing and narrating war. For Rousseau, war is essentially a system of misrepresentation. The virtual or bird's eye view, one commanded by gods, if you like, or by an imaginary Napoleonic sightline, is contradicted by confused eyewitness accounts on the ground. By contrast, the virtual cinema of the modern battlefield no longer requires embedded witnesses. It can be played and replayed without taking actual participants into account. Instead of being seen for what it is, a physical act of demolition, war becomes a set of signifying practices. Twombly's interest in battles can be inferred from a group of abstract paintings belonging to the same period as his shift to grey-ground minimalism, 5 paintings called, strangely, Synopsis of a Battle, 1968, consisting of cone-shaped constructions, vortices, blueprints for the segments of a space capsule, who knows, covered with measurements, calculations, and scribbled directional diagrams. It's a bit of a stretch, but I suppose it could be loosely construed as fan-shaped battle formations viewed from a diagrammatic perspective. 2 are inscribed with the word issus, another synopses. Others contain words such as enter, flank, and right, along with calculations that may or may not correspond to troop numbers, distances, and times, or casualty statistics. The group is related to the orbiting gyrations around an axis in the Orion series. You can see the shield and pole signs there, and other paintings of the same moment that launch vertiginous flipping forms like an airborne deck of cards. The gravity-defying space junk of the Bolsena paintings, and I'm showing you one of them there, of 1969, coincide with the Apollo moon landing during the summer of 1969, which Twombly followed closely. And in case you think I'm making all this up, Twombly himself has said actually he was completely riveted by the moon launch, the moon landing, and his painting is involved. Paintings like this are closely involved with that representation of the kind of overcoming of the forces of gravity in, as it were, deep space. Now, the so-called blackboard paintings could be seen as an abstract visualization of infinitely prolonged movement in space and time, a kind of projective geometry, the wheeling of planets and constellations, or temporal durée of lines in space. The link is, of course, often made with the early 20th century Italian futurism of Bala and Baccioni. Twombly projects the movement of three-dimensional bodies, the darkness of deep space, and the folding of matter, orbits and lines with potentially infinite extension, or deflected by the combined forces of space, gravity, and time, requiring complex mathematical calculations and corrections. Like solutions to abstruse space-time problems, the blackboard paintings practice flat geometry as if in a four-dimensional world. To some, they suggest Twombly's interest in diagramming the invisible movements in space and time that had earlier been captured by Muybridge's photographs, to which Rauschenberg had actually introduced Twombly. Now, the cerebral abstractions of the synopsis of a battle paintings could hardly be further from the heat and dust of war. Battle theory, however, involved an imaginary plurality of bodies, a large body, organized as military squadrons and divisions in synchronized wheeling formations strategically positioned in space and time. The word synopsis has in fact specific associations with military history. Major General John F.C. Fuller's three-part Decisive Battles, Their Influence Upon History and Civilization of 1940 prefaces each chapter with a synopsis, i.e. a condensed overview, or what you might call, cunningly, an abstract. Fuller had been struck by how much could be learned from the battles of Alexander the Great in teaching military history. Perhaps cued by Twombly, the catalogue raisonné of Twombly's paintings notes the description of the Battle of Issus in Fuller's then recently published The Generalship of Alexander the Great, published in 1958. And of course, Twombly had his own reasons for being interested in Alexander the Great. He commemorated the birth of his son, Alessandro, in mid-December 1959, a year later, as the start of a new epoch with one of his most frenetic canvases, The Age of Alexander, which he painted between December 59 and January 1960, an extraordinary painting, and now in the Menials. Besides being a prolific military historian, Fuller was an early theorist of World War I tank warfare who became an energetic advocate of modern mechanized war. And I told you this was an excursus. It's coming to an end. His battle plans, diagrams of troop disposition and topography look nothing at all like Twombly's synopses of a battle. They just could not be more different. But they are a kind of abstraction, actually. Twombly may have recycled his own title from an earlier synopsis of a battle belonging to 1960, which you see above, a much very characteristic of his work would be around the cusp of 1960. But perhaps a different form of citation is involved. During this period, Twombly was fascinated by Leonardo's drawings of drapery, chaos, and anatomy, and he incorporated freely cheap reproductions into his own collages. The conical diagram of synopsis of a battle, Twombly's synopsis of a battle, uncannily resembles Leonardo's iconic military invention, his design for a prototype tank, the ponderous contraption whose wheels, driving in opposite directions, would have prevented it moving except in circles, firing on all sides. It was Leonardo who, of course, famously defined the art of drawing as discovering how the line, the generating axis of each object, is directed through its whole extent. The art of drawing diagrams refers not to material objects as such, but to their extension and their axis. In his excellent monograph on Twombly, Richard Lehman argues that the six-spoke war chariot of Twombly's Anabasis, painting of 1983, reference, of course, to Xenophon's history of the expedition of Cyrus the Younger, coincides in Indian mysticism with the symbol of mastery of mind over body, charioteer, if you like, over chariot. During the early 1980s, Twombly's chariot of expeditionary conquest morphs into the whirling dervish of Sufi mysticism. The wheel is transformed into a symbol of the artist's bodily energies. HRIH, the Buddhist heart seed, or the Summa of mastery, with its mantric Om Mani Padme Hum, 1982, fusing ancient Greek, Egyptian, and Buddhist symbols into a spinning vortex. And of course, the scribble is itself the kind of primal mark of the line, large and small, as anybody with children knows. The primal scribble becomes the enlightened bodhicitta of the prayer wheel. Twombly's Chariots of Fire, I'm suggesting, can be read as a discourse on the furious Dionysian energies of hand and image, what Pound, the vorticist, called the vortex or cluster of fused ideas endowed with energy. Okay, now I'm going to come finally to what I'm calling shades of eternal night. States, wrote Immanuel Kant, states do not plead their case before a tribunal. War alone is their way of bringing suit. But by war and its favourable issue in victory, right is not decided. That's from Kant's Perpetual Peace. A decade after his blackboard paintings, Twombly embarked on his monumental 10-part ensemble, 50 Days at Iliam, 1979. Varnado, who I mentioned at the start, evokes its solemn drumbeat of iconically isolated moments and what he called the memorial tombstone verticals of the series. Completed in time for the Whitney retrospective of 1979, 50 Days at Iliam, so Twombly recalls, was inspired by the frenzied energy and headlong forward rush of Pope's heroic Iliad, and painted to a Wagnerian accompaniment. For Nietzsche, and perhaps for Twombly too, Wagner's music resounded with the real grief of the Homeric men in parting from life. If once the lamentation is heard, it will ring out again of the short-lived Achilles, of the leaf-like change and vicissitude of the human race, of the decay of the heroic age. That's, of course, Nietzsche. And I suppose Twombly was unaware of Francis Ford Coppola's ironic use of the Ride of the Valkyries as a soundtrack for the helicopter attack in Apocalypse Now. Use Wagner, scares the hell out of the gooks. I'm sure you know that line. But it is interestingly a film whose long-delayed premiere actually took place the same year that 50 Days at Iliam was shown at the Whitney. The aggressive masculinity of A for Achilles is associated with Twombly's deliberate misspelling of Iliam, not Ilium, but I-L-I-A-M. And he says of his painting, "My whole energy will work, and instruments and things will have a very definite male thrust. The male thing is the phallus, and what better way to describe the symbol for a man than the phallus? No?" I like that, no. In 50 Days at Iliam, the instrumentality of the male thing, however, hangs under the melancholy sign of death, or shades of eternal night. It's very much paler than I would like there, but anyway, shades of eternal night. The same motif surfaces in a number of Twombly's works on paper during this period as shades of eternal night. Studies perhaps for the big painting. Pope's Iliad associates clouds not only with invisible or unrepresentable events, with grief, dust, divine intervention, but also in a famous simile with massed armies. The word shade ambiguously refers to death as well as apparitions of the dead. The wraith-like shade of sad Patroclus appears to Achilles in his dream, eluding his outstretched arms and appealing for burial so that he can enter the underworld. Like a thin smoke, he sees the spirit fly, and so on. The hovering multifoliate cloud is repeated in the colour-coded shades of the three doomed heroes that dominate Pope's Iliad: Achilles, raging red, of course, the divided blue shadow of Patroclus, and blanched, godlike Hector. Their memorial canvas confronts the viewer on the end wall of the gallery in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where the series now hangs. The dramatist's personae are listed on opposite walls, bloody Achaeans facing off against Ilians, with the doomed house of Priam cancelled out by the cloud shade sign, using capital. I haven't got very good pictures of this. Here you are. Using pseudo-capitals that use the triangle of the Greek delta for alpha. Actually, I'm sort of become interested in the idea that Twombly was very familiar with the Etruscan lettering, such as survives, but which was the way in which the Greek story came into Italy, pre-Roman, as it were. I need expert advice on this. Anyway, these names are, of course, listed as if on great memorial slabs. They're not just cast lists. 50 Days at Iliam uses naming as a defining gesture that links monumentality to memorialization. In Book 7 of Pope's Iliad, when Hector issues an ironic challenge, he imagines the name of his vanquished enemy monumentalized on the seashore for future ages to read. Greece on the shore shall raise a monument, which when some future mariner surveys, washed by broad Hellespont's resounding seas, thus shall he say, a valiant Greek lies there, by Hector slain, the mighty man of war. The stone shall tell your vanquished hero's name, and distant ages learn the victor's fame. Now, in Homer's Iliad, the burial mound would, of course, be nameless. Oral memory alone preserves the fate of Hector. But for Pope, reading archaic Greece through Roman or Etruscan eyes, the presence of a proper name is a given in classical funerary epitaphs. Occupying the future anterior tense, thus shall he say, the stone shall tell your vanquished hero's name. 50 Days at Iliam displays the names of the dead as half-effaced inscriptions on ancient memorial tablets. Twombly's anachronistic Hellenization suggests the capitalized form of early Greek inscriptions cast into a future that exceeds Homer's imagination, but not, of course, Pope's. For Homer, Greek writing had yet to be invented. The three shades are flanked by two immense battle scenes, Achaeans in battle and Ilians in battle. This is Achaeans in battle. Twombly's triangular motifs, which you could just about see, these sort of triangular motifs, implicate the aesthetics of fascism. Might is right. The thrusting phallic Achaeans, the penis makes a direction, and that's used as direction in the painting to force you one way, says Twombly, confront the Ilians' defensive wedge-shaped shield formation, led by Hector in the foreground and urged on from the rear by a scrotal chariot, the house of Priam, in the back, all towards that side, all labelled carefully. As the flaming Achaeans hurtle into battle above the artist's palette sign, wherever that is, palette sign, I may have got out of, I think it is there, at the bottom. As the, where was I? As the flaming Achaeans hurtle into battle above the artist's palette sign, jutting angles, V for victory, signal the supporting role of Thetis, Athena, and Hera, and among the mass shields of the doomed Ilians, other triangles, stylized war chariots, are named for Paris, Apollo, Artemis, and Ares, the gods whose partisan intervention impinged on the human battle. Now, the directional impetus for 50 Days at Iliam is, of course, the vengeance of Achilles, a fiery, heat-seeking missile whirling out of a black cloud of grief to become the blazing fire that consumes all before it. Pope's Achilles is already a maddened flamethrower, torching everything in its path. As is Pope, from his fierce eyeballs, living flames expire and flash incessant, like a stream of fire. One of Homer's great similes compares him to a wildfire, as when a flame the winding valley fills and runs on crackling shrubs between the hills. In Pope's own preface to his translation, the vengeance of Achilles becomes, in fact, a figure for Homer's poetry itself. Homer, he writes, boundless and resistless as Achilles, bears all before him. Referring to that unequaled fire and rapture, which is so forcible in Homer that no man of a true poetical spirit is master of himself while he reads him, Pope writes of a reader hurried out of himself by the force of the poet's imagination, as if overcome by an unstoppable army. And as is Pope, the course of his verses resembled that of the army he describes, and he translates the line, "They pour along like a fire that sweeps the whole earth before it." So Homer's poetry becomes on fire, he says, like a chariot wheel by its own rapidity. Drawing Pope's language irresistibly into its orbit, Homer's sublime imagination, he writes, is like a powerful planet which in the violence of its course drew all things within its vortex. Now, writing of the omnipresence of violent imagery in the modern world, the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy contrasts the force of the violent person, he says, a sort of pure, dense, stupid, impenetrable intensity, with the force of truth, not to be confused with sublimity, as I think it is in Pope's account of Homer. The truth of destructive violence, writes Nancy, is nothing other than the truth of the fist and the weapon. As Benjamin's critique of violence points out, violence seeks to imprint its mark on the victim in the interests of power through spectacle, torture, or juridical punishment. Hence, for Nancy, self-authorizing violence, quote, always makes an image of itself. Now, the violence of truth is also monstrative, but what it demonstrates is the force of the image itself. That, he writes, is what all painting shows us, in tirelessly and constantly renewed modes, the working of the search for this force. But as well as showing the fiery force of the image, I think Twombly's 50 Days at Iliam is date-stamped with a very specific historical moment, the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War, and I want to turn now to this moment in the history of the memorialization of war. By 1979, the question of a permanent Vietnam Veterans Memorial had entered the public domain. In Pope's Iliad, faced with the futile sacrifice and pointless outcome of the Trojan War, Ulysses, of course, famously advocated putting a time limit on grief, ever pragmatic, enough when death demands the brave to pay the tribute of a melancholy day. Get the mourning done. Despite Ford's and Carter's attempt to heal the nation, American soldiers and veterans had yet to receive adequate recognition. After a protracted and shameful war, patriotic commemoration did not come easily. The same year that 50 Days at Iliam was first shown in America marked the establishment of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Maya Lin's controversially abstract Vietnam Veterans Memorial of 1981, inscribed only with the original 58,159 names of the American dead or missing in action, eschews nationalistic or patriotic mourning. Its abstract, minimalist, angled wall bears the names of the dead or missing on a polished surface designed to reflect the reader's own face, a visual metaphor for the funerary epitaph's address from the past to future mourners. The Iliad closes with the ransom of Hector's body by Priam, whose paternal grief moves Achilles to tears. One reading suggests that through his compassion and his willingness to accept Priam's gifts, maddened Achilles recovers his lost standing as a tragic hero. But Homer's narrative offers a glimpse of a different mode of settling disputes, a judicial process that was not available to Achilles within the poem, although it intersects with Benjamin's hard question whether there are no other than violent means for regulating conflicting human interests. The fiery heart and blackened ring of Twombly's shield of, sorry, I missed out those, I'm sure you know that those pictures, that's the fire that consumes all before it. Here is Myolin's Vietnam memorial with the names on it. Many of you will have seen this, and the strange way in which the face of the viewer as you walk by is reflected. The fiery heart and blackened rim of Twombly's Shield of Achilles is hung to confront viewers as they approach 50 Days at Iliam in Philadelphia. Forged by Vulcan, Achilles' ekphrastic shield, illustrated in 18th century editions of Pope's Iliad, depicts a world excluded from Homer's archaic civilization. The city at peace and war, civic and legal ceremonies, ambushes and slaughters, ploughing and harvest, herding and hunting, dances and revels. So whirls the wheel in giddy circle tossed, and rapid as it runs, the single spokes are lost, writes Pope. The shield, in other words, opens a window onto the future that Achilles and Hector will lose by their deaths, along with an ethos that is incompatible with the archaic world already overtaken by the polis. Laocoon's, Lessing's Laocoon, an essay on the limits of painting and poetry, calls Achilles' shield the famous picture which more than anything caused Homer to be considered by the ancients a master of painting. Now, the classical scholar Gregory Nage follows Lessing in singling out the shield's scene of litigation over a dead body as a pregnant moment frozen in time. This is Pope. There in the forum, this is a description, narrative, what's on the shield. There in the forum swarm a numerous train, the subject of debate, a townsman slain. One pleads the fine discharged, which one denied, and bade the public and the laws decide. The case under debate, of course, parallels Achilles' choice about whether to accept compensation for the slaying of Patroclus, revenge or ransom. The case is conceptually foundational to the emergence of the polis. For Lessing, the scene of litigation makes the poet equal to the artist, not through what he shows, but through what he leaves to the imagination. Homer is able to give us virtually, as it were, what is depicted on the shield, but, so Lessing argues, where painting exists in space, poetry exists in time. In other words, he writes, Homer does not paint the shield finished and complete, but as a shield that is being made. The shield, that is Lessing's limit case in the argument between painting and poetry, comes to stand for its own and the poem's making. Nage's point of departure is the legal issue under debate. What is the best definition of the limit, the pera, that the audience is being asked to judge? Homer's scene of litigation is pushed to the periphery of the shield within the poem, and then beyond it to the interpretive community of the Iliad's audience. The Shield of Achilles opens a virtual window onto the present as Homer's story within a story spills out into the poem to form an interpretive moment, reopening what the Iliad seems to close when Achilles accepts the Trojan ransom and returns Hector's body to his grieving father. Nage's counterintuitive reading has Achilles remaining frozen within the poem in the posture of the obstinate litigant that will lead to his death, that of refused compensation. Achilles is both complained against and plaintiff, both avenger and victim, in a chain of substitutions that makes him in the last resort simply a man fated to die, as the horses assert. Nage's implied audience respond to the repetition of Homer's within a story in the time present of the poem's performance. Who is guilty? Who is the arbiter? How should the case be decided? These questions draw the audience of the polis into the poem, much as the faces of mourners are reflected in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and we've seen a very similar argument about the killing of Osma bin Laden, actually. The evolution of the Iliad becomes a trope for the way in which it can be read to include even its modern audience. Naja's argument returns us to the circular movement at the heart of Twombly's shield, whether revolving chariot wheel or fiery mantra, the self-perpetuating cycle of war and peace in the Greek polis. It also anticipates the recurrent nature of public mourning. Twombly's Shield of Achilles installs his remediation of Pope's translation of Homer's Iliad in the historical moment of its performance, drawing the viewer into his somber rehearsal of Homer's ancient mythos and making it a memorial for the forever uncompleted mourning that closes the Iliad. Last o'er the urn, the sacred earth they spread, and raise the tomb, memorial of the dead. I want just to end with a coda called Twombly. Sorry, there's the 18th century shield with all its goings on. Okay, now, and I'll just quote Achilles in The Hospitality of War: "We left them their dead as a gift to remember us by." A spurious derivation of Twombly's unusual surname links it to the Latin word for burial mound, tumulus, Homer's tombos. Among Twombly's sculptures are a pair of shapeless piles that seem to refer to burial mounds and perhaps even to his own name. For all their whiteness, their startling viscerality, globs of plaster heaped into a conical mound, implies that the shaping activity of the sculptor has its origins in the experimental. The viscosity, of course, is that of plaster of Paris, which Twombly has called his marble. Twombly's sculptures include small chariots, such as this one, untitled, 1978, and another one, 1978, another one, 79, whose chunky or triangular forms recall the hurtling chariots of 50 Days at Iliam. Along with his warlike miniature vehicles, Twombly created a variety of objects with Sumerian associations. For instance, I can't pronounce it, Ctesiphon, 1987, using barrel hoops to render the huge vault of the ancient Persian monument in modern Iraq. Other works inspired by Sumerian artifacts include the Thicket of Ur, 1990, Thicket of Akkad, Sumer, 1991. These fragile, tree-like objects, using gardeners' tags for leaves, bear a litany of the names of ancient cities now ruined or lost: Ur, Uruk, Izin, Zabalan, Yuma, Eridu, Nippur. And a later thicket of 1992 has leaves and flowers growing out of an overflowing box, as if from a rudimentary sarcophagus. Twombly's memorial sculptures record the fate of Sumerian culture, so-called cradle of civilization, birthplace of writing, wheels and arches, as well as agriculture and irrigation. The first Gulf War of 1991 brought viewers the spectacle of the highway of death, with its charred corpses and bombed-out convoys of trucks, buses and cars immobilized in the gridlock of flight. I want to end with two funerary sculptures belonging to 1991 and 1992, Epitaph, 1992, and the one I began with, Thermopylae, 1991. Epitaph consists of a rough wooden box, white-painted, bulging obscenely with matter, human remains, if you like, reduced to a visceral mess, retaining their capacity to shock despite being transposed into white plaster. The lid gapes half open, as if to reveal what should be hidden. On it is written Achilles' grim epitaph, the hostile graffiti of a departing army. In the hospitality of war, we left them their dead, as a gift to remember us by, Achilles. Twombly appropriates Achilles' sardonic voice as a reminder of the ugliness of war, its brutal disregard for human life, disfigured, charred, dismembered bodies left unburied, as a warning. This hostile gift travesties both hospitality and memorial. For Kant, the laws of hospitality entailed the rights of a stranger not to be treated as an enemy when he arrived in the land of another. In this cynical reversal, the invader bears the gift of death. Twombly's gaping box, overflowing with dehumanized matter, is a savage commentary on the inhospitality of war. Twombly has often painted images of flowers springing out of a pile of manure, fiery plumes rising from mounds of rich brown earth. Traditionally, flowers spring out of the grave as a symbol of remembrance and renewal, as in the crude box of Twombly's memorial thicket. Thermopylae uses this poignant image for stylized tulips implanted on a small grave mound or tumulus like broken spears. The last stand of the Spartan army is commemorated elsewhere by Simonides' famous epitaph, translated by Schiller, "Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their words." A poignantly raw and fragile monument, Twombly's grave mound uses white plaster to cover what looks like muslin bandages wound onto a willow frame. A faint smear of red on the top suggests the stain of blood on a freshly dressed wound. On one side is written the title, Thermopylae, and on the other the opening lines from Cavafy's poem, "Honour to those who in the life they lead define and guard a Thermopylae." And the lines could be read as a tribute to the steadfastness of the soldiers who defended the pass, were it not for Cavafy's bitter twist in the tale, and even more honour is due to them when they foresee that the Medes will break through after all the treachery that led to their death. So all soldiers are betrayed to their deaths in the end. Twombly's immense dripping Bacchus cycle, I really am ending now, of 204 to 5, coincided with the year of the first and second battles of Fallujah, the bloodiest years of Iraq occupation and the insurgency that followed. The Bacchus paintings have been linked by Malcolm Bull to the fury of Achilles' 12-day brutalizing of Hector's body, towed behind his chariot around the grave mound of Patroclus. Bacchus Sylax, the winged Bacchus, becomes his identical twin, Bacchus Mainominos, raging mad, the red of wine turning into a whelming tide of blood. These paintings twin the ecstasy of Nietzsche's Dionysius with murderous violence. Pope's Iliad tells us how after Lycurgus took on the gods and drove out the Thracian cult, Bacchus headlong sought the briny flood. Homer does not relate the sequel. In punishment for his disrespect, Lycurgus was driven mad. Mistaking his own son for an ivy plant sacred to Bacchus, he lopped off his extremities. The frenzy of Twombly's Bacchus Mainominos can be read as a critique of the madness of war, the hubris of those who wage it, the terrible cost to one's own children and to the children of others, limbless or dead. At the opposite end of the spectrum from these huge yet controlled scrawls, some of you may have seen in the Tate in 208, one final citation from 205, a whimsical heart-shaped label on one of Twombly's more precarious sculptures reads simply, "Snafu." For those unfamiliar with its World War II provenance, this everyday expression is military shorthand for situation normal, all fucked up, an acronym I will arbitrarily appropriate for the carefully crafted rhetoric of outrage appropriated here for the public performance of grief. Thank you.
Now we have a visceral distaste for the mass grave. The image of heaped bodies indistinctively piled into the gaping earth is redolent of the brutality of the racially motivated violence of the 20th century, or the collapse of social order in the face of natural disasters. The mass grave is anathema to the bourgeois individual. It's a failure of the human ideal. Yet in the 5th century democracy of Athens, the idealized democracy that stands at the head of West's self-representation, and which has been since its inception one of its most insistently, indeed violently, profit exports, the mass grave was introduced as a privileged symbol of democracy itself. The war dead of democracy were honoured by a mass grave. Funeral rites were removed from the traditional sphere of the family and taken over by the state. The war funeral became a collective civic ritual. A leading politician was chosen to deliver a speech over the grave to the assembled citizens. And in this speech, in the logic of democracy's drive towards equality, was observed. No individual warrior, no individual act of bravery was ever named. The city itself was the subject of each speech. The memorial erected over the grave was equally austere. It listed only the first name of each dead citizen. It did not include the patronymic or deme names, the usual and necessary marks of identity. You were buried as a bare citizen, named but not singled out or properly identified. And this democratic civic ritual knew itself to be the overturning of the tradition of naming and memorial in Homer. In Homer, every warrior who dies is named and properly identified in those swirling battle narratives where names and body parts clash with such repetitive drive. I had nightmares at school recalling the terrible precision with which the Iliad itemized the spear through the teeth, the sword through the soft place near the hip, the mouth that hit the ground, still trying to form a word of pleading. What's more, in Homer, every warrior fights for his individual fame, his immortal kleos. Achilles prays for the destruction of his own side, so that they should feel the need of his individual prowess all the more. Achilles willingly gives up his life in return for fame. Even Hector, the city defender, revels in the potential of his own glory, his individual glory, as a motivation to go to war. But Pericles, as the historian Thucydides represents him, when he gives his funeral speech over the mass grave of the democratic Athenian war dead, says, "We have no need of Homer now." Athens makes its own memorial. The city embodies its own collective, nameless praise. The body parts in Sire Twombly's epitaph are nameless stuff. On the lid is written, "In the hospitality of war, we left them their dead as a gift to remember us by Archilochus." The sardonic epitaph grimly plays at least a double joke on its own status. A gift to remember us by, a present from aristocrat to aristocrat within the exchanges of guest friendship, becomes a violently distorted interaction by its namelessness. The dead are a nameless memorial, not of themselves, but of the visit of a nameless enemy. The epitaph that scores out the possibility of naming denies its own role, its own function of memorialization. But we have the name of the poet, Archilochus, the individual who writes the we and the they of the poem, who is memorialized by the artwork signed by Sire Twombly. How does the name of Archilochus sound out against the we who leave the dead? How does the act of artistic memorialization of individual fame, performed by Archilochus and re-performed by Twombly, write a countertale to the nameless body parts? The nameless dead, absent from Homer, shadow Western art. The whooping Indians around the circle of the wagon train are killed as namelessly as buffaloes. In the battle scenes of history painting, the ranked soldiers march namelessly to their doom. It's not always easy to resist our complicity with the silencing of the massed dead, which is one condition of possibility for warfare's violence. Narrative always places us as the cowboys and the wagon train, not as the falling Indians, as the survivor from the camp, not the swiftly dispatched woman, as the soldier running up the beach, not the instant victim of the first salvo. Our complicity with the hero's tale, which narrative requires of us, is part of the continuing power of war's discourse. Twombly uses names, written names, all over his art, just as he uses the title of works to individuate, to specify a narrative. In this, he follows Greek models. Look at this pot, for example. You can see how the bristling arms of the warriors are tagged by the names that float in the visual space and demand that we read the image as a slice of epic action, named and identifying figures. Even the pig gets a name, not just exemplars of masculinity. We turn the mass dead into stories by the act of naming. So how is the Vietnam Memorial used? Viewers, and this has been well discussed, are faced by the mass of names which become like the nameless dead by virtue of their sheer profusion. But the visitors walk along and pick out names and look for specific names or identify particular figures, even if they don't know anybody who's dead. Everybody points at a name. We counter the numbing repetition of names by individuation, as we counter the numbing silence of the mass dead by the act of naming. The turn to the classical past to explore the representation of the present is a question of repetition and its compulsions. Whose war are we fighting? Whose myths are we reenacting? Whose body is it anyway? For my money, and I use that term advisedly with Warhol in mind, there is no greater artist of the anxieties of repetition than Andy Warhol. You'll all be familiar with the famous repeated images of the icons of modernity, Marilyn Monroe, Kennedy, the soup can. I want to look today at how Warhol reflects not just on repetition and its role in the production of the images of desire in capitalism, but how this involves him in a dynamic relation to the classical past. And I want to begin in a surprising place with an ultra-trendy art magazine, The Studio, in 1893, which published some photographs by Willem von Glöden. Von Glöden moved from Germany to Sicily in 1878 for his health, where he lived for the last decades of the 19th century, and he spent his time there taking naked posed photographs of the local inhabitants. And these were sold partly as anthropological studies of the Mediterranean, but mostly as classical studies, the Mediterranean body in the open air. And he dressed up the boys in classical garb and on occasion knotted their hair into Pan's horn, which uncannily anticipate Robert Mapplethorpe's devilish self-portrait. The Studio published the photographs precisely as classical scenes, brought vividly to life by photography, a medium in the 1890s still provocatively novel as a technique. And most of von Glöden's negatives were deliberately destroyed during the Second World War by Italian fascists in their brutal and instrumental campaign for social purity. Several dozen images survive, and they've never gone out of print, and they're now, I guess they're largely circulated as gay erotica, and less commonly, if you're lucky, as examples in the history of photography. Here's a typical picture. A naked young man is posed by a suitably Dionysiac vine, and he's lightly embracing a Renaissance bronze statue of a naked athlete based on classical Greek models, and behind them there's a wall with Greek-style etchings. The picture suggests that the young man is in contact with the Renaissance and with the classical past. It's a classical body alive today, a continuity of artistic, physical, and aesthetic form. Well, Andy Warhol owned this photograph, which he bought at an auction, and he liked it enough to draw it, with a typical shift of emphasis, you might think, onto the boy's genitals. And this drawing was used in a volume edited by Roland Barthes, perhaps the most influential modernist theorist of photography, as well as, of course, literary critic of genius, in Paris in the 1980s. The classical body, as a fantasy of desire, is the repeated trace through from Victorian photography into high modernist drawing. Now, Warhol had a special relationship with the camera. He always carried one in his last years. It forms a link between his obsessive concern with the world of advertising, the reproductive capacity of technology, with commercialism, and above all with the circulation of celebrity. He used the camera to make art. "I want to be a machine," Warhol famously asserted, and the camera became a central medium through which he constructed his specific anatomy of desire's imagery. Throughout these last years, he constantly took Polaroid snaps of his friends having sex, often quite baroque sex at that. He invited rent boys up to his studio. He invited his colleagues to strip in their lunch breaks and masturbate for him and photographed it. He left thousands of such pictures, I can assure you. I've seen them in the Warhol collection. And he also made out of them some quite remarkable art, particularly when he stitched together, literally, with a needle and thread, sets of repeated images. This photo is one of Warhol's studio images, self-consciously plays with his history of representation. It's another perfect Greek body, poised like a statue, but a statue about to step off the plinth. The ripples in the water disturb any Narcissus-like gaze into the reflective mirror of the pond, another joke on the artistic tradition. The body is not quite classical in its pose. It's thrown off kilter by the captured moment of incipient movement. It's a knowing and playful twist, both of the lure of the ancient body and of the cliché of using the classical to encode homoerotic desire. This is just Warhol having some smart fun with the ideal Greek body and the artistic tradition he knows he's part of. It's a moment, there's no story, the joke is just the disruption of classical iconography. What happens next to that model, what happened before, is certainly not part of the image's enticement. But this image is altogether a more sophisticated piece of work. It's one of the stitched works, only very recently exhibited for the first time in New York, and the subject is one of Warhol's rent boys. There are many other unpublished images of this young man in a single day's sequence of him stripping and posing for Warhol, now preserved in the archive. The same chair appears in the studio for many of Warhol's subjects. And the boy lolls back naked in the chair, hands folded across his stomach, head thrown back. And there are 4 identical images stitched together. And if you look really carefully, you can see the thread faintly in the reproduction right in the middle of the picture. Now, any classical art historian will instantly recognise this icon. It's a modern version of the Barberini faun. The faun is a classical version of the transgressive body, flopped out after drink and or sex, genitals central to our image and our gaze. Warhol takes the classical image of debauchery and updates it for the street life of modern New York. Now, the repetition of the image, 4 together, moves the piece away from a witty joke on an old image. It asks, how many Barberini fauns make up the sexual imagination? What role is there for repetition in the imagery of desire? How different is one hustler from another? How many times do you need to look at the image of the sexualized body? How much are erotic images the repetition of past erotic images? Can you desire without cliché? Can you desire without repetition? Warhol uncovers a buried history within our image repertoire. We're all victims of old love stories. Can you desire without the poses of those old patterns, without those old Greek bodies, those Victorian women, those virgins and whores? His picture raises a very awkward question for the viewer. What do you see when you desire? With Warhol, the repetition of the object of desire puts the sexualized body in line with the commodification, commercialization and circulation of soup cans, or the face of Marilyn Monroe. The camera objectifies, as Suzanne Capella argued with most complete force. But here the camera's repetition both poses a question about the object of desire as object, and for many readers, I suspect, rather de-eroticizes the encounter, however attractive the young man may seem. This objectification, or better, this fetishization of the objectified, is fundamentally connected to a lack of narrative, a namelessness. Warhol's images resist narratives and names. Each image seems to have a minimal backstory, no future. There's no poised juncture, as the repetition itself seems to assert. So even Warhol's movies refuse narrative, movement often, the excruciatingly long, unmoving camera shot of a building, the face of a man experiencing oral sex, where all the action, as in Greek tragedy, is off stage, silent messenger scene. In place of the story, we have the fetishized, repeated object. With the 4 images of the naked hustler, unlike the boxes of a cartoon strip, there's no sequencing, no difference, no narrative line. The provocativeness of Warhol's vision stems from combining the realism of the medium of photography with the resistance to the fictions, the narratives, which make up reality. Now, I find Warhol's anatomy of repetition extremely stimulating for thinking about war. And I think Warhol lets us see a central tension, or perhaps a vortex of ideas, in Twombly's project. From one angle, war is a repetition of the past and a terrible exercise of desire, a compulsion to live out inherited models and stereotypes. War's repetitions, war's violences, reduce human beings to unnamed masses. But while the act of naming, of individuation, is a counteract to the namelessness of repetition or the silence of the massed victim, it's also an act of complicity. The hero's narrative also functions to keep cannon fodder as fodder. It's not just the repetition of the word phallus in Twombly's descriptions of his work, or Mary's repetition of Judith Butler's fuck you, that makes me worry about the place of desire in the art of war. We could put this question by asking, if war does violence to the body, what does Twombly's art do to the body? There's Leader and the Swan, sexual violence. What is it, art doing to the body? What does it desire of you? It seems to me that war's compulsive repetitions overlap with desire's compulsive repetitions. In being caught in the struggle to maintain a sense of an individual, named and cherished story, the life worth something, as Butler puts it, over and against the overwhelming power and complicities of the undifferentiated, the massed, the silenced. Twombly's hazard is that scrawling a name across a canvas will work. The sick joke is that it's Achilles' name again.